I was in the middle of a Sunday afternoon drive when my phone rang, and a voice I barely recognized told me my daughter was coding in the delivery room. I pulled over on a side street somewhere between Mississauga and home, and I just sat there with the engine running, not processing any of it, because the last time I'd spoken to my daughter Renée, she had been laughing. She'd been 37 weeks along and she'd called me that Thursday to say she'd finally packed her hospital bag, and had I remembered to fill the car with gas, because she wanted me to be the one to drive her when the time came. And now here was this nurse telling me to come as fast as I could, and somewhere in the background I could hear machines. I want to tell this story the right way because it matters. Not just for Renée, but because of what I found out when I got there. What her husband Callum was doing while our daughter was fighting to stay alive. Renée was 29 years old. She had been with Callum for 4 years, married for 2. He was 34, worked in commercial real estate downtown Toronto, dressed well, talked well, shook hands like he meant it. From the beginning I told my wife Sylvie that something about Callum felt slightly off to me, like a house that's been staged perfectly, but has no furniture in the closets. Sylvie said I was being protective. Maybe she was right, maybe I was just a father who couldn't let his only daughter belong to someone else. But I want you to understand something. By the time Renée went into labor, I had already noticed things. Not suspicions exactly. More like quiet facts I was collecting without knowing why. Callum had started traveling for work more often than his job required. I knew this because I worked in the same industry for 20 years and I knew what that portfolio of his actually demanded. He was traveling to Ottawa a lot. Not Montreal, not Calgary, not Vancouver. Ottawa. And when I asked him once what he was doing up there, he looked at me with this very smooth smile and said there was a developer he was trying to bring on. I nodded. I didn't push, but I remembered. Renée mentioned in the 8th month of her pregnancy that Callum had suggested they consolidate their savings into a single joint account. She thought it was romantic, a sign of real partnership. She called me while she was making pasta and told me this and laughed and said Callum called it merging lives. I didn't say anything to her right then. But after I hung up, I sat with it for a while. They'd kept their finances mostly separate until that point. They had a joint account for household expenses, and they each had their own savings. Renée had done well. She was a physiotherapist with a private clinic in Oakville, steady income, careful with money, the way her mother raised her. The suggestion to merge everything at 8 months pregnant struck me as strange. I didn't know why it struck me that way until later. Renée did not move all her money. She told me this after, and she smiled when she said it. She'd moved a portion over to keep the peace, but she'd kept her main savings account and her TFSA untouched and separate. She'd mentioned to her friend Judith Arsenault, 41, who had been through her own divorce 3 years earlier, that something felt off about the timing of Callum's request. Judith had said quietly, keep something for yourself, just in case. So Renée did. I didn't know any of this on the day she went into labor. I just knew that my daughter had called me Thursday laughing, and now it was Sunday and she was coding. I drove to Trillium Health Partners in Mississauga in 22 minutes. I don't fully remember the drive. I remember parking crookedly in a visitor spot and not caring. I remember the automatic doors and the smell of the hospital hitting me and my wife Sylvie already inside, having gotten there first because she'd been visiting her sister in Port Credit that afternoon. Sylvie was standing near the elevator bank when I came through the doors, and the look on her face told me everything and nothing at the same time. She's still in there, Sylvie said. They won't let us in. What happened? Placental abruption. It happened fast, they said. She came in at noon. Everything was fine, and then around 2 it just. Sylvie's voice broke. She pressed her hands together. They're doing everything. I put my arm around her and we stood there, and then I looked around the waiting area. Callum was not there. I assumed he was inside with Renée. I assumed they had let the husband in and that he was sitting beside her. I didn't think anything of his absence in the waiting room. I was too frightened to think about anything except my daughter. About 40 minutes later, a nurse came out to update us. She introduced herself as the charge nurse, a woman named Beverly. She had to be in her late 50s, gray hair pulled back, the kind of calm that comes from decades of seeing the worst and still showing up. Beverly told us Renée had been stabilized, that there had been a critical period, but they had brought her through it. That Renée had technically gone into cardiac arrest for a short time and had been resuscitated. That she was not conscious yet, but her vitals were holding. I grabbed the edge of a chair. Beverly looked at me with steadiness. She said, "She's strong, we're watching her closely." I asked about the baby. Said, "Babies. And that was the first time I heard the word in the plural. Sylvie made a sound beside me. I looked at Beverly and she explained gently that there had been a second heartbeat they had confirmed only in the final weeks. Twins. A boy and a girl, both early, both in the NICU, both alive. I sat down. I couldn't help it. My legs just went. Renée had known, Beverly told us carefully, for some time. She had disclosed it to her care team. It had been her choice to manage the information about her pregnancy privately. I didn't understand then why Renée had kept this from us. From me and Sylvie, yes, that was surprising enough. But from Callum too, apparently. Beverly's careful phrasing told me as much without saying it directly. I didn't fully understand until I saw where Callum was. When Beverly turned to go back through the doors, I looked down the corridor, and through the window of a small family consultation room near the nursing station, I saw Callum. He was in there with a woman I did not recognize. She was perhaps 30, dark coat, leather bag over her shoulder. They were not sitting the way two people sit when they are receiving bad news together. They were standing close, their heads bent together, and Callum had his phone out, and he was showing her something on the screen. I watched him for a moment, and I felt something I had no name for yet. I went back to sit with Sylvie. I told myself I had misread it, that she was a colleague, a friend, someone who had come to support him. That is what I told myself for the next hour. But then Beverly came out again. She came out not with a medical update, but with a quiet and specific purpose, and she asked if she could speak with Renée's family privately for a moment. We moved to a corner of the waiting room, and Beverly lowered her voice. She told us that while she could not share details of Renée's personal conversations, Renée had left a sealed envelope with the nursing team at the start of her third trimester. She had brought it in at a regular prenatal appointment and asked that it be held. It was addressed to her parents, to me and Sylvie, and it was to be given to us if anything went wrong during delivery. Beverly put it in my hands. I looked at the envelope. Renée's handwriting on the front, clean and careful, the way she always wrote. I didn't open it yet, I just held it. Then Beverly said something else. She said it quietly, and she held my gaze while she said it. She told me that earlier that afternoon, before Renée had been moved into emergency care, Callum had come to the nursing station and asked a series of questions. She would not tell me exactly what questions, but she said that after he left the station, she had stood there for a moment and thought about what he had asked and how he had asked it, and it had troubled her. She said, "In 30 years of doing this job, you develop a sense for things." She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. I went to the consultation room. I knocked. Callum opened the door, and for just a moment, for one fraction of a second before he arranged his face into an expression of grief, I saw something else there. Something that wasn't grief at all. Something that looked almost like calculation. "Stuart," he said. He called me Stuart, not Dad, which he sometimes called me Stuart. "Where have you been?" I asked. I had to make some calls. I've been trying to manage," he gestured vaguely. "This is my colleague Nadine. She came when I called her. I needed support." The woman Nadine gave me a brief and not entirely comfortable nod. "Your wife," I said, "is in there fighting for her life, Callum." He nodded, and his expression was correct, and his eyes were wrong. I went back to Sylvie. We sat together for another hour. I opened Renée's envelope. She had written 4 pages. Her handwriting was steady the whole way through, which told me she had written this when she was calm, when she was thinking clearly. She had written it sometime in her 7th month. She noted at the top, on a Tuesday evening after Callum had left on one of his Ottawa trips. She told us she had been tracking Callum's behavior for several months. She was careful in how she wrote it. She did not use words like suspicious or afraid. She wrote, "I have been paying attention, and what I have noticed has led me to make certain decisions." She told us she had spoken to a family lawyer, a woman named Constance Beaumont, 53, family law in Mississauga, a name she had gotten through Judith, in her 6th month of pregnancy. She had made sure her TFSA and her primary savings were legally protected as separate property under Ontario family law, properly documented. She had drawn up a new will. She had made sure that the mortgage on the Oakville house, which was in both names, had a clause her lawyer had helped her structure. She told us that she had not told Callum about the twins. She wrote this plainly, "I found out at 20 weeks that I was carrying 2 babies. I chose not to tell Callum because I was not yet sure what I was going to do, and I needed time to think without his reaction becoming the thing I was managing." She told us she loved us. She said if things had gone smoothly, she would probably never have needed us to read this letter, and she hoped we were reading it for no reason, and everything was fine. She ended with, "If it's not fine, I've done everything I could to make sure the kids and I will be okay. I need you to know that." Please don't be angry on my behalf, just be there. Sylvie was crying by the time I finished reading it aloud to her. I was not crying. I was doing something else, something quieter, which was understanding my daughter for the first time as a fully separate person who had been carrying all of this with remarkable composure. Around 9 that evening, Renée regained consciousness. They let us in to see her briefly just for a few minutes, 2 at a time. I went in with Sylvie first. Renée was pale and tired, and there were more machines than I was comfortable seeing, but her eyes were open and she looked at me and said, with absolutely no preamble, "Did they find them? The babies?" "They found them," I said. "They're both in the NICU. They're small, but they're okay." Renée exhaled slowly and closed her eyes for a moment. "Both of them?" she said. "Both of them." She didn't ask about Callum. He asked to go in after us. The nurses told him Renée had requested a brief rest and they would let him know when she was ready. He stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets and Nadine had gone by then, and he looked, for the first time that day, genuinely uncertain. I did not speak to him that night. Over the next 2 days, the picture became clearer. Not all at once, in pieces. Judith Arsenault came to the hospital the following morning, and she and I ended up having a long conversation in the Tim Hortons in the main lobby. Judith was direct in the way that someone is direct when they have already spent too much energy being diplomatic. She told me that Renée had confided in her over the past several months, and that what she could tell me was that Callum had been traveling to Ottawa to see someone, and that someone was not a property developer. Judith also told me that Renée had been very deliberate in the weeks before her due date, that she had visited Constance Beaumont a second time to make sure everything was in order, that Constance had confirmed that Renée's assets were properly documented as separate property, that any claim Callum might attempt to make in a separation would be significantly limited. She was 2 steps ahead, Judith said. She's been 2 steps ahead for months. I thought about what Beverly had told me, about the questions Callum had asked at the nursing station. I thought about him in that consultation room with his phone out, showing Nadine something on the screen. Later that week, I spoke to Constance Beaumont directly, with Renée's permission. Constance was methodical and unimpressed by Callum in the way that good family lawyers often are. She told me that she had strongly advised Renée on documentation of separate property from the beginning of their consultations, and that Renée had followed through completely. She also told me, carefully, that any application Callum might make regarding the matrimonial home would face significant complications due to how the mortgage structure had been arranged, and that his income contributions to shared expenses had been meticulously tracked by Renée in a shared document Constance now had a copy of. In other words, Renée had not been a woman waiting for something bad to happen. She had been a woman who understood something bad might happen and had prepared for every version of it with quiet and thorough precision. Callum came to the hospital twice more that week. On the second visit, Renée asked to speak with him alone. I don't know exactly what was said in that room. When Callum came out, he was not the same man who had walked in. He stopped in the corridor and stood very still for a moment, and then he went to the elevator without looking at anyone. What I know is that Renée told me afterward, in her dry and careful way, that she had let him know she was aware of Ottawa, that she had let him know her lawyer had everything organized, that she had told him the names of both babies, a boy named Felix and a girl named Marguerite, and that as far as she was concerned, his involvement going forward would be entirely mediated through Constance's office. Callum did not fight her on the separation. His lawyer made some early gestures that Constance dispatched efficiently. The matrimonial home was sold 6 months later. Renée took her share and her protected assets, and she and the twins moved into a 2-bedroom in Oakville, close to her clinic, close to us. He pays child support for 2. He will be doing that for a long time. Renée went back to work part-time at 4 months, full-time at 8. She hired a part-time nanny through a service Judith recommended, a kind woman named Elspeth who the twins adore. I go over every Sunday. Sometimes I just sit on the floor and let Felix and Marguerite climb on me while Renée makes tea, and we talk about nothing much. There are moments when I look at her across the room and I try to work out when she became this person, this clear-eyed, steady, quietly prepared person. And then I remember what she wrote in that letter, that I had taught her to pay attention. I don't know exactly when I taught her that. I don't remember a specific conversation, but she said I did, and I am going to take her word for it. Beverly, the charge nurse, became someone we knew by name. Renée sent her a card at Christmas. I don't know exactly what Beverly overheard that afternoon in the corridor near the nursing station, the thing that made her come out and speak to us the way she did. She has never said more than she said that day. But she did what she did and it mattered, and Renée knows it. What I know about that Sunday in the hospital is this. There was one person in that building who was thinking about my daughter. One person who was asking the right questions about what her future would look like. And it wasn't Callum. It was Renée. It has always been Renée.